This is the second day of what has become known as the invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces came in after bombs hit towns and cities across the country early yesterday morning. Now, many cities and towns in Ukraine are believed to be controlled by Russian forces, but it's not clear yet what exactly that means on the ground.
Russia is terrorist! Russia is terrorist! Russia is terrorist!
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Tab Talks. And my guest with me today is Dr. Mike Linville. Hey, Dr. Mike.
Hi, Dr. Michelle. It's so good to see you again.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show because I think it's important for people to understand what's happening in the Ukraine. And I think you're going to be able to give a lot more perspective than I think we're seeing just on the television, because you actually were local. You still do have connections with the Ukraine and you understand the history. And I think that's going to be extremely important for people to understand the history behind what's happening, that it's not just a war or a fight. There are some true philosophical and worldview issues that are being addressed here, and that's what's happening. So I guess, first of all, can you start off and just give the audience a little background about your expertise and why you're the person, as far as I'm concerned, that can unpack this question for us?
Well, thank you, Dr. Michelle. Thanks for the invitation. I was greatly privileged. My wife and family were privileged to live in the capital city of Ukraine, in Kyiv, as it's pronounced, from 1997 to 2000. We were there just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and had the opportunity to lead and help start one of the early post-Soviet Bible colleges in that part of the world. And we, quite frankly, just fell in love with the Ukrainian people. When we returned to the United States then in 2000, we very much felt strongly about continuing the work that we had begun. And so we established a nonprofit ministry and have been working in Ukraine ever since. So really about 25 years now we've been involved in that country and with the people there.
So just so people are clear, you have employees right now in Ukraine.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So that we can unpack this, I think it's important for people to understand geography. And you've provided us, and I want to thank you, with some pretty interesting maps about the actual landscape and the countries that geographically abut Russia as well as Ukraine. Can you kind of walk us through the geography and why that's so important?
Sure. Ukraine is situated in a really interesting place. The name Ukraine actually means borderland, and it essentially serves as a border between Russia and the rest of Europe. Russia is considered to be both a European and an Asian country. The Ural Mountains are considered to be sort of that dividing line in Russia, but practically speaking, Western Russia doesn't really share culture with Europe. Ukraine is sort of wedged in between the two, and there's been this sort of identity, a struggle to develop an identity in the years since the Soviet Union fell. many Ukrainians are gravitating toward Europe and sort of becoming part of Europe, while a few others, particularly older Ukrainians, may still see themselves as having much more in common with the Russians. And so there's a tension that has existed there really for the last 30 years, but more and more, particularly as social media and the information age has allowed people to observe outside of their own country the kinds of lifestyles, the kinds of activities that other peoples are doing. Ukrainians have been gravitating in larger and larger numbers toward wanting to adopt and become part of Europe, much more integrated into Europe. So one of the maps there shows where Ukraine is located in relation to Russia and Eastern Europe. And it's important to note also that Ukraine is a large country. It's about the size of the state of Texas, just to put it into perspective.
Wow, okay.
And so while it's smaller, of course, than Russia, which is a huge country, it is the second largest country in Europe. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Can you share with us, I know there's a picture that you have. I mean, it's actually a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful area. And I think people need to know, when we see pictures of that region, this is what we see. But you've also shared with me pictures of what it's really like. So it's almost like there's media dressing being done, so we can see these ornate capitals and these beautiful ornate buildings.
Right.
But the people don't live that way. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Ukraine has a population of about 44 million people. There are a handful of large cities, probably 2 or 3 really large cities. The Kyiv, or Kiev as we often say in English, is the capital city of about 3 million people. It's actually a beautiful city. It's a 1,500-year-old city. It has many Golden Dome churches. The origin of the Eastern Orthodox Church goes all the way back to the Lavras on the banks of the Dnieper River. The Dnieper River divides the capital city in half. It's a river about the size of the Mississippi. It's a huge river. And on one of the banks, on the western bank, or what's actually referred to as the right bank, is a 1,000-year-old monastery that has been functioning for 1,000 years, complete with underground churches. It's a beautiful area. Although if you're claustrophobic, you may want to think twice about visiting.
Think twice about that. Yes. Wow.
And so naturally, photographs of the capital city tend to be very beautiful because you often see these Golden Dome churches. You see a lot of high-rise residential apartments. You see the river running through the middle of the city. But the reality is that the vast majority of Ukrainians don't live in big cities. They live in small towns and villages, in apartment buildings that are, and they're frankly a very economically challenged people. Ukraine is a poor country. There have been much of the last 30 years, the unemployment rate has gravitated between 50, 60, and 70% in some of these towns and villages.
Wow.
And Ukrainians, interestingly enough, will continue to go to work in many cases, even when they don't get paid. How many people do you know who will do that? And why do you think they do that? Well, what's interesting is because unemployment rates are so high in those areas, Ukrainians will often continue to go to work in the hope that eventually they'll begin to get paid again. They know if they quit the job because they aren't getting paid, they have essentially no prospects for a job again. And so they will continue to work for no pay in the hopes that eventually they will be paid again.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that geography lesson. And I think that tells us a lot about the Ukraine people and their pride in terms of wanting to be purposeful and meaningful in what they do. Let's talk about their worldview. And give me a sense, obviously work, they value work. What's at stake now that they're at war?
Well, it's interesting. The Ukrainian people have, they have a history that has been replete with, being steamrolled and conquered by many other nations and groups throughout their really hundreds of years of history. Without getting into a lot of the detail, that particular region in that area of the world is actually very, very old. It started with a very large state called Kievan Rus, which was the birthplace of everything today that is considered Russia. So when Putin and Moscow and Russians think about their history and their heritage, they look to Kiev and see that as sort of where it all started, so to speak. However, for whatever reason, over many centuries, Ukraine doesn't ever seem to be able to establish and hold their own independence. That certainly was true during the 75 years of Soviet rule, but even for several centuries prior to that, that was also the case. And so for Ukrainians, they were the first of the 15 Soviet republics to declare independence on August the 24th of 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And they have been extremely proud of the fact that they are independent, but they have struggled mightily to actually try to bring the kinds of freedoms and what we would consider democracy to their nation because of the inherent corruption that has existed in the political system. While the government changed, many of the politicians under the Soviet times stayed in positions of power, even under a free and independent Ukraine, and as a result, exploited the resources of the country in ways that enriched them, so that Ukrainians were still actually struggling against a corrupt system in order to try to improve their quality of life.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the actual formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Because when I think about that, I think, okay, we now had these republics who now wanted to become countries, their own countries, still very poor, not having a lot of resources. And in my research, I found out that the United States basically has given about $3 billion in aid to support Ukraine, to help them support them to reach sovereignty. I think that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
But how is that support from the US and the EU, how has that been perceived by Russia? And has that created a little bit of the conflict that we're seeing now?
Well, that's a very good question. The reality is that Ukraine, I would say from my perspective that Ukraine has been a pawn between the West and between Russia because of its strategic position geographically and because of its history. We've got Russia pulling on one side, trying to make sure that Ukraine doesn't escape its sphere of influence. And we have the West on the other side, particularly as NATO has expanded across Eastern Europe. We've seen Ukraine as a large piece of real estate that we want to use, quite frankly, as a way to contain any potential expansion by Russia. One of the points that I want to make that I don't think your viewers may be reading anywhere, frankly, is that the nation of Ukraine was a location where much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was actually based in southeastern Ukraine. In 1994, just shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was an agreement that was signed between Ukraine, included the United States, the UK, and actually Russia, called the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum said that if Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal, consisting of about 1,900 nuclear weapons, that the US, the UK, and Russia would protect Ukraine from any potential foreign invasion. Of late, when that subject has been brought up, because many people have said, we're out, we're not sending troops. And I would be honest, I'm not particularly a fan of sending a lot of Western troops. I think Europe, as being much closer to Ukraine than the United States, frankly, I believe has more of an obligation to support Ukraine even than we do. Yet, that said, The Budapest Memorandum guaranteed Ukraine that what's happening today would not happen. Since then, I just read last week, the German chancellor said, well, it wasn't actually a legally binding document. Well, then why did you sign it?
Wow.
So the Ukrainians feel betrayed. They feel betrayed.
No, I don't think I've heard one peep about that on Western television.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Let's go back a little bit of history. Let's talk about the former Ukraine president, Viktor Yanukovych. He initially had favored transitioning that country to have better alignment with Europe. And doing so, he thought they would, of course, receive protections under NATO. But Ukraine, because it was a communist state, they didn't meet the requirements for being in NATO. And I think people need to understand that's why there's this, why doesn't NATO just help them? Well, they don't meet the requirements to be a member of NATO. So President Yanukovych understood the voices of the people in Ukraine to welcome the opportunity to move towards a more democratic government. And so by the time Russia said, well, you know, we want to have a relationship with you too. So now Yanukovych is trying to play man in the middle, which is very difficult to do, because if you're trying to move to a democratic government and you're still trying to play good and nice with the Russian and a communist government, those just don't, to me, line up. And I think that people got very frustrated. So when the EU actually proposed an association agreement to Yanukovych, he rejected it.
Yeah.
And the people were like, well, wait a minute. We thought we were moving towards the West and the EU, and he rejected that. And so people got upset. They violent protests emerged, and they ousted him.
Yeah.
They didn't want him anymore. So can you explain what happened after they ousted him? Because he kind of betrayed them, didn't he?
He sure did. He sure did. Yeah, let's back up just a little bit. When he, I would tell you that the vast majority of Ukrainians considered Yanukovych to be a puppet of Russia. He came out of the old Soviet system. Interestingly, he also was a man who had spent, as a younger man, spent several years in prison for violent crimes. He was like not a nice guy.
Wow.
But when he was elected president in 2004, it was deemed that his election was fraudulent. And so that election was actually overturned. And it was part of what was called the Orange Revolution in 2004. Interestingly enough, just a few years later in 2010, he was reelected or elected legitimately the first time. And that's when you mentioned the agreement, the EU trade agreement that was in front of him, was something that Ukrainians really wanted. And he had intimated that he would sign it. And at the last minute, Russia offered their own trade agreement, and he did a bait and switch. It infuriated the Ukrainian people because it reinforced what they already believed about him, that he was really merely a puppet of Putin's wishes. And so it led to yet another revolution in 2014 called, it's called several things, Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. Interestingly, when Yanukovych was experiencing this from his position in power as the president of the country, he sent out troops to fire on the protesters in the main square of Kiev called Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which is Independence Square, and killed 100 Ukrainians. Today, they're referred to as the Heavenly 100, who gave their lives when it became clear that the people were going to, one way or the other, find Yanukovych and do him harm. He stole several $1 million from Ukraine and was escorted by helicopter out of the country, where he lives even to this day in exile in Russia.
Wow. Whoa. Okay. So let's keep it moving then.
Yeah.
You now have this transitional government that's put in place.
Yes.
And now you see these rebels emerging. And I think you have a map for us that shows these
Yes.
kind of out pockets of the resistance. During that period of unrest, Russia also kind of took advantage and they invaded Crimea.
Yeah, they did.
Why did they do that?
Well, in 2000, after Yanukovych went into exile, they held an election shortly thereafter, and they elected a man named Petro Poroshenko. He was the country's largest candy manufacturer. He was the candy man, they said. He was recognized as a legitimate president by the West and by Europe. But in that same year, my understanding from Ukrainians I know, that Putin took advantage of this because he had lost the ability to work through Yanukovych. And so immediately they began to see this area called the Donbass area in eastern Ukraine come into conflict. The excuse used was that there were Ukrainian separatists. Ukrainians don't actually believe that, but it was the way Russia justified moving into that area. For the most part, Ukrainians believe that Putin simply sent in, mercenaries or military forces that would actually stir up trouble, calling themselves Ukrainian, so that it would justify moving Russian forces in there. And that conflict has been going on ever since, 8 years. The war in Ukraine didn't start last week. It started 8 years ago there. And by extension then, Putin also annexed Crimea. Crimea was a property of Russia up until 1954, when the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev essentially gave it as a gift to Ukraine. Crimea is an incredibly important strategic place on the map, because the Russians have had a naval base stationed in Sevastopol in Crimea for forever, throughout the entire Soviet period. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, they have maintained that port. They actually paid rent for this space. I've actually been to this naval base and seen this. And Poroshenko decided he wasn't going to rent that space to them anymore. The location of Crimea, which is a port, which Sevastopol is a port city on the Black Sea, is Russia's access to the Mediterranean. And Putin made it clear, rent it to us or not, we're not leaving. And so once Putin heard that Ukraine was trying to divorce itself of that relationship, Putin, essentially in a chess match, decided he was just going to take Crimea back. And that's exactly what he did. Ukraine does not recognize that, but Russia moved in and actually began to distribute Russian passports to the residents there. And I actually know people who lost everything, who were Ukrainians living there, who had to walk away from their apartments because Crimea all of a sudden became very hostile to Ukrainians. I actually know of someone who, a woman who was a Ukrainian whose husband had Russian sympathies, and it was the end of their marriage. She moved out of Crimea. So it devastated families there. It was an extremely difficult time and still is. All the promises of prosperity have not materialized, and so life in Crimea is not easy even today. But strategically, militarily, and otherwise, it's a crucial piece of real estate that Putin has no intentions of letting go of.
I'm glad that you brought up the point that the war didn't just start a few days ago, that there's been these warring factions for some time, with the rebels not recognizing Ukraine as an independent country, still trying to treat it like it's a republic. And slowly they've been whittling away at their real estate for some time. So this fight didn't just start. Okay, yeah. We now know, I'm going to move on because I got so many questions for you. I don't know where to go. Putin does not have a worldview of democracy, clearly doesn't. Can you talk about what his true worldview is? I mean, what is the end game for him by going into the Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dr. Michelle, and frankly it's a fairly nuanced matter as I see it. There are a number of different perspectives on why Putin is doing what he's doing. And I believe that probably several motivations that are part of what's happening. On the one hand, Putin seems to want to preserve certain social traditions and customs that have been part of Russian culture for a very long time. You know, the Russian people, even going back to the Czars of Russia, they view their leaders very differently. The Tsar of Russia, even though the Tsars were very hard on the Russian people in terms of heavily taxing them, and those kinds of treatment of peoples led to the Bolshevik Revolution back in the 19-teens, and ultimately that led to the Russian Revolution that began the Soviet Union, was essentially a populist movement at its face value when it occurred. But the perception of the Tsar in Russia by the Russian people was that this was a wholly appointed individual, that the Tsar was actually the brother of Jesus. Many people have written that they believe Putin sees himself very much in that kind of role. He sees himself as the savior of what has been a Russian tradition for centuries. That's one perspective, and I think there is some truth to that, perhaps. On the other hand, we've seen him behave in ways that are completely autocratic. There's no freedom of the press. There are actually Russian people who are protesting what's happening in Ukraine. They're being arrested. I think as many as 6,000 or more have been arrested already simply for showing up and waving the Ukrainian flag outside of government buildings in Moscow. So as long as Putin and his oligarchs hold power, and they benefit financially and through political influence, he seems to avoid talking about communism per se, which was obviously the system that the Soviets were so well known for. Interestingly, in a speech he gave to the Russian people last week, he actually criticized Lenin. Lenin was a very reverent figure, known as the father of the Soviet Union. Lenin is still lying in state. I've actually been to the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square. He's still lying in state in a Snow White style coffin with a glass covering. Much of what we know about, just as an aside, much of what we know about mortuary science today comes from the Russians' efforts to preserve Lenin in Red Square, in the mausoleum, interestingly enough. And so the fact that Putin criticized Lenin was really quite interesting and shows that he really didn't think that Lenin, and even by extension Stalin, did it quite right under communism. He seems to be operating in this sphere where he wants the people to understand that he's moving in a direction that would perhaps benefit them more, and yet by his actions he doesn't seem to demonstrate that really at all. This leads us, if I can take just a moment, into another perspective that I think is important for your viewers to understand. There's something called power distance, and I know you're familiar with this. This is a cultural value dimension that helps explain the relationship between authority figures and their citizens with regard to the distribution of power. So for example, in the United States, we have what's considered to be low power distance. We're a society where individuals want to see power distributed equally. As Americans, if we see a politician taking bribes for votes, for example, we're outraged by that, right?
Yes.
In Russia, however, in a high power distance culture, citizens accept this unequal distribution of power so long as they believe that their leader is looking out for their best interests. That's why you see someone like Putin enriching himself, and the Russian people are okay with that. I'll give you an example, a personal example of this. When we were living in Ukraine, there was a re-election of Leonid Kuchma, who was the second president under independent Ukraine. Their term was 5 years. He was up for re-election. And all I had heard in my years living there was about the graft, the corruption, how he and the politicians were taking resources that had been nationalized under the Soviet system and privatizing them, and then forming little cabals that would buy those resources for pennies on the dollar personally, and they were literally robbing their people blind from their positions of power. But every Ukrainian I talked to, this was 1999, every Ukrainian I talked to said they were going to vote to re-elect Leonid Kuchma. And I shook my head and said, why? Finally, one of them sat me down and said, okay, here's the deal. For 5 years, we believe that Kuchma has been able to line his pockets and acquire all the wealth he needs. Our hope is that if we re-elect him for the next 5 years, he'll actually do something to benefit the people. If we elect a new president, we know what he'll do for the next 5 years. It blew my mind. Very difficult as an American to understand that kind of mindset. But after all, how many times have we heard that Russia, and by extension, I think many countries that share some of that culture, is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Very difficult sometimes to understand some of it.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
We talked, and it's this same hopefulness that I think the Ukrainian people have. They actually were very hopeful and doubted that their country would be invaded.
Yeah. Oh, yes. In fact, my staff, the people I know there, I talked with many of them in the days leading up to the most recent invasion, and they pretty much all said, it doesn't look good, but yeah, they were really in denial. I've actually had a couple of them say to me, I was in denial. I just didn't believe this would happen. And so I think in that regard, it's actually caught them sort of a bit flat-footed. Some prepared, some just didn't want to believe it would happen, and unfortunately now they're finding themselves spending a lot of evenings in bomb shelters. To be honest, I know some folks that are in bomb shelters even as we speak now.
And what's so frightening about that is we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and people are in bomb shelters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So obviously we hear and we read that people are being displaced. They're leaving Ukraine in large numbers to go to other countries. Right. What are the implications of this mass exodus? Is that something that you think the Russian government wants to happen? Or do you think they just want them to lay down their arms and just deal with the fact that they're going to take over?
Yeah, I think they want them to lay down, and I actually think Putin thought this would be pretty easy. When you look at the numbers, the statistics, Russia outguns Ukraine by a factor of 10 to 1, both in personnel, in military hardware. I don't think Putin thought there would be much to this. In recent days, there have been a couple of reports out that he's increasingly frustrated that this hasn't gone so well. I think he did miscalculate that the Ukrainian people weren't just going to roll over and take it. It's a very different situation when you're fighting for your family, you're fighting for your land, you're fighting for your homes, and I'm not quite sure that's been taken into account. Many of what I understand, many of the Russian soldiers that are invading are younger men without a lot of military experience, and they certainly didn't expect to come against the resistance that they have come against. It's fascinating to me the extent to which Ukrainians are demonstrating resilience. They're resilient people anyway. And I guess I need to explain a couple of points real quick about resilience.
Yes.
Just the 20th century alone, under the Soviet era, the Ukrainian people have suffered more than any other part of the 15 republics that we refer to as former Soviet satellite countries. In 1932 and 1933, Stalin decided to privatize and collectivize Ukrainian farmland. It's referred to today as Holotamir. It was a forced collectivization. He took their farmland away from them. He marched millions of Ukrainians out of their country and into Europe, into gulags, work camps, 3 million Ukrainians starved to death. It was an intentional move by Stalin to steal the agricultural lands. Ukraine is well known for its agricultural resources. It was considered the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It also has a lot of manufacturing resources that would be of value to Putin. But millions of Ukrainians died. A mere dozen or so years later, during World War II, we as Americans often, we think about World War II, we filter it through our frame of our involvement as a nation, not only in Europe, but in the Pacific. What we don't often think about is that there was not just a Western front, there was an Eastern front. And that Eastern front ran right down the middle of Ukraine. And so when the Nazis came into to Ukrainian soil, they met the Red Army. And that's where much of the bloodshed occurred on the Eastern Front. It was in Ukraine. And Ukrainians took the brunt of all of that. In fact, Ukrainians have told me over the years that the Red Army from the Soviets, the Russians and the Soviets, treated them worse than the Nazi army did, the Nazi military. And so they were being literally decimated on both sides. Millions of Ukrainians died as a result of that front. And so it just seems like time after time, the Ukrainians have suffered. Their national anthem is called "Ukraine is not dead yet." What does that say to you?
Wow.
Yeah, it's remarkable. They're really, really resilient people. They don't like American rom-coms either. They don't like American movies because American movies have happy endings. And that's just not realistic.
That's just not realistic to them.
Not realistic. They don't like American movies. No, because that'll never happen. You'll never have a happy ending, right?
Wow.
So that's a bit of the mindset. So I share all of that to simply say, I believe there will be a humanitarian crisis, even though there are some Eastern European countries opening their borders. In fact, I've been really amazed at the extent to which the world is paying attention to this and offering ways to help and support. Canada has begun to offer some refugee status for Ukrainians who can get there. I know the United States is providing additional support in the way of some small arms. Countries are actually taking steps to support the Ukrainians, short of sending in troops. And so the Ukrainians sort of understand that they're on their own, actually, at least as far as manpower. In fact, in recent days, the Biden presidency offered the president of Ukraine, he's interestingly a younger man named Zelensky, offered Zelensky and his family, they offered to evacuate him to a place of safety. And Zelensky's response was, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition."
I need ammunition.
He's not going anywhere. There are some high profile people, from the president to celebrities in Ukraine, to politicians who have wealth and means and status. They're not going anywhere. They're putting on their flak jackets and they're taking up arms in a country where even citizens have not been allowed to have weapons. They're passing out weapons. They're teaching women in large groups self-defense classes, personal protection. They're showing them how to use a knife for hand-to-hand combat. This is a country that is fighting for its life. And it's been remarkable to see. As painful as the images are that we see in the news coming out of there, these are people who I'm just amazed. I'm amazed at their resolve.
Dr. Mike, I think you have to share, because I'd asked you earlier, what are the Russian people being told is happening? Because, their media is controlled. So
Yes.
what's the messaging? You shared that with me, and I just want you to share that with the audience.
Yes, the Russian people are being told that Russia has not invaded Ukraine, that in fact, the Russian presence in Ukraine is a peacekeeping mission designed to protect Russian citizens in Ukraine who are at risk by these radical Ukrainians who wish them harm. And so they're not even allowing, there have been quite a few Russian casualties, soldiers. They've not even yet been allowed to be, their remains being returned to Ukraine, to Russia, because they would have to explain that. It's going to be really interesting to see if the Russian people begin, because there are already mothers calling officials saying,
"Where's my son?
Where's my son? Why can't I get a hold of my son?" So I'm not sure how Putin will manage that, but he's got his hands full. But the Russian people are being completely deceived.
Russia's Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu once called mass media another arm of the armed forces. In states like Russia, this is definitely the case. Russia is a militarized authoritarian state with no real media freedom. Russian media broadcasts two types of propaganda. All propaganda tries to weaken people's critical thinking, but Russian propaganda for Russians is different than Russian propaganda for foreigners. When Russia tries to propagandize foreigners, they usually emphasize that Russia is no worse than Western countries.
Well, if Kosovo is a special case, then Crimea is also a special case. It's just equally special.
I think that's one of the fundamental misunderstandings from the West in looking at Russia, is that Russia has its own set of values. They're just different. Go ahead.
Propaganda made for Russians, however, usually focuses on the specter of an enemy. This enemy is ultimately responsible for all internal problems. They are very clear about who the enemy is: the United States. This enemy is everywhere. Anyone who disagrees with Putin is presented as an American puppet. What does America want? Russians are told America is trying to destroy Russia, its last remaining opponent. Of course, Ukrainians who are just defending their country from Russian aggression are always American puppets.
Russian television carried many stories about U.S. troops on the ground in Donbass.
В операции на востоке Украины, которую проводят киевские власти, участвует около 400 американских наемников. Это солдаты частной военной компании «Academy». Ее сотрудники не раз оказывались в центре громких скандалов. Во время войны в Ираке их обвиняли в убийстве мирного населения и контрабанде оружия.
Russian propaganda has recruited people to come kill Ukrainians in Donbass alongside the Russian army. After watching Russian coverage of events in Ukraine, this man came to fight fascists committing genocide in Donbass. After 6 months, he left without finding any.
И все эти дни, пока вы воевали, вы верили в справедливость ваших
Не, ну да, самый главный перелом у меня же в этом произошел, потому что я-то думал, там фашисты эти, и потом оказалось, что никаких фашистов я не видел в принципе.
Russians are told that they are a brave people fighting against the evil global superpower. Vladimir Putin is presented as the only leader capable of leading Russia against this huge threat. Russians are now ready to accept any deprivation in order to avoid war. This is why the idea of war is the main instrument of influence in contemporary Russia. It undermines critical thinking, consolidates society around a military leader, and explains the hardships of an economic crisis.
You lead a nonprofit ministry in Kiev. And obviously you have staff over there that are in bomb shelters right now. What was the goal or the mission of your organization while you're in Kiev, while you're there? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, yeah, thank you for asking. We, we, in the years we lived there, we invested in mostly younger people who were called into ministry. In Soviet era, anyone who was involved in the Christian faith, for the most part, they had to operate underground. There's actually a plan by the evangelical church in Ukraine today, should Russia win this fight, they are likely to go back underground. But at that time, in the early years after the Soviet era, there was an opportunity to bring biblical and theological training to people for the first time in nearly 100 years. And so we had the great privilege of investing in about 100 young men and women who went through a 2-year college that we ran, and then began to move out across not just Ukraine, but across many of the republics, the former republics of the Soviet Union. One of the things that most people don't know is that of all 15 of those republics, Ukraine has been now for 30 years sort of the missionary hub of the former Soviet Union. There has been quite open and strong religious freedom in Ukraine. I view this threat not only as a political threat to the country, but as one that would seek to diminish the freedoms that have allowed, the gospel to go out from Ukraine and into so many other countries across that part of the world. And so our organization, when we came back to the United States, very much felt like we should build upon the relationships that we had begun, the connections that we had there. And so for the first several years, we really focused on providing pastoral training across, we went to every major city in Ukraine. We went to half a dozen cities in Russia, including 2 in Siberia, where no missionaries seemed to ever go, and provided just basic pastoral ministry skills training, something that most pastors had never received and just didn't know what to do. We've sort of transitioned that from that into a couple of other areas. We really focus on 2 things now. We're involved in a medical and humanitarian aspect of our work, largely investing in more than treating individuals. We're really investing in physicians and healthcare providers in ways that will help them begin to not only practice medicine more effectively, but to do so from a holistic perspective, which also incorporates a spiritual component. We've also developed a very strong leadership training and development part of our ministry. One of my colleagues there, my Ukrainian colleagues, has a terminal degree in leadership, as do I. And so we've collaborated on many different projects. We collaborate with a lot of other organizations to try to help bring leadership skills in a country where they don't really value leadership. The concept of leadership in the Soviet era was one that was really, quite frankly, a negative. There was an old saying there, it's the tallest blade of grass that gets cut first. If you were a leader, you were corrupt, you were interested in power, and for the most part, people didn't like you very much. So we have been working for a number of years to try to better understand how can we help Ukrainians and even Russians. Until the war started in 2014, we were still working in Russia. How can we help them better understand what it means to be a good leader? What are the competencies? What are the character? What kind of character, is required to be a good leader? That's been a very challenging process, because we're working against deeply embedded mores and long-held beliefs in a culture where transparency is not something they're accustomed to, because under the Soviet system, transparency would get you in trouble. And so those are some of the things that we really focus on. We're a small team, but we've been able to make some, build some relationships over the years that have allowed us to make some inroads there. And so we're grateful that God has opened doors to those areas of ministry that we're involved in.
Dr. Mike, your ministry is powerful in that region. I know that you've been doing it some time and focusing a lot of your efforts on developing leaders in that area. And I always give my guests the last word, but there is something I do want to ask you about, because we did look at, when I talked about the end game for Putin, we look at Ukraine. Is that all he wants?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. this has also been largely missed by our media. For a very long time, I think your viewers have probably heard in the news that Vladimir Putin would love to rebuild the Soviet Union. In fact, in 2007, he actually made a statement to George W. Bush, who was president at that time, that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think even our intelligence and our political administrations have operated with this idea that Putin eventually wants to put all those countries back together and rebuild that Soviet Union. Last week, just a couple of days before he sent his troops to invade, Vladimir Putin made a nationally televised speech on Russian television and said to the Russian people that what he wants to do is to rebuild the Russian Empire. And I think we have a map that illustrates that. Yes. The Russian Empire extends far beyond into Europe, far beyond the borders and boundaries of the Soviet Union. If in fact Putin is serious, and there's no reason to believe that he isn't, he's interested in reacquiring, as part of the Russian Empire dating all the way back to the 17th century, countries like Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. And my concern and my fear is that we may be seeing the beginnings of that type of ambition, if you will, on the part of Putin. We've seen world wars start over these kinds of moves. Hitler did the same when he started to take over countries. The last thing any of us want is World War III. In fact, Putin even alluded recently to establishing his nuclear alert at its highest level.
Yes. What
is he thinking? Is he really a madman, or is he simply a high stakes gambler? I'm not sure I can answer that question, but this is pretty scary. I think we're all seeing maybe the greatest threat to our world that we've seen since World War II. And now that nuclear weaponry are part of the equation, it's even hard to imagine what that could mean.
Dr. Mike, I'm going to leave you with the last word. You have been a wealth of knowledge, and I just feel so blessed and fortunate that you came on the show to enlighten all of us. I know I had to bring you on here because you just enlightened me, and I knew that there was just so much that we don't know in the West and didn't know about the history and what we're seeing unfold. What do you think is important for the audience to take away?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share that. I guess I would just maybe share with you some of my personal perspectives, and that is that there is a difference between governments and citizens. You know, I know that we can look back at human history and we see it filled with countless wars, and in many cases it fails to record the humanity behind the conflicts. I've never experienced war personally. And despite the fact that I'm 6,000 miles away, it feels very personal to me. I've lost a lot of sleep in the last week, and I'm not trying to make this about me. I'm simply saying all of a sudden this is not just a news story. This is personal. There are children who've died. There are women who are being killed. I heard a report recently that in Kharkiv, some of the Russian soldiers they're putting women and children on buses, telling them they're going to evacuate them, when in fact they're using them as human shields in front of them with the Ukrainian military. Those are tragic. If they're happening, they're tragic. And I say all of that just to simply say that, you know, with friends and family in bomb shelters right now, fearing for their lives, I have a hard time really imagining those emotions. The Ukrainian people are wonderfully warm, relational, and giving people. Many of them are quite poor, but they're generous and kind. Many of the Russian people I know are much the same. But I believe that this terrible invasion of Ukraine represents the actions of a bully against a resilient people who simply want to be free. Ukrainians are outmatched. But I would encourage any of your listeners who pray to join with me in praying for what I have referred to in recent days as an Old Testament miracle. We need God to knock out an army as he did so many times in the Old Testament in protecting the Israelite people. We need to see that happen in the days ahead. And we're praying that that's what God will do.
Mike, I just have to leave you with, there was a picture that you sent to me, and it brought tears to my eyes. It was a young couple that I think was supposed to get married in May, and they moved the date up.
Yeah.
Because they just didn't even think they'd live to May.
And the next day, they took up arms and joined the military. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. These are amazing people.
Yes, they are. Thank you, Dr. Mike, for coming on Tap Talks. I knew I was going to end up crying, and I did, but I want to thank you. And I just want to tell the audience out there, prayer does change things. And, you know, if there's nothing else we can all do, we can all pray for a speedy resolution to what's happening in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michelle. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, Dr. Mike.
Yeah.